Have you ever stopped to imagine what happens when a person who feels everything suddenly feels nothing at all? Not because their heart has hardened, not because they've lost their humanity, but because they've finally uncovered the fragile boundary between true compassion and quiet self-destruction. It is a turning point so subtle yet so powerful that it can redefine an entire life. Carl Jung once gave it a name, shadow integration. And when an empath, someone who has carried the weight of countless invisible storms, reaches that inevitable breaking point, something remarkable occurs. They don't explode in rage. They don't collapse in tears. They don't plead for anyone's understanding, nor do they beg for a place in someone else's heart. Instead, they step back. They withdraw from the cycle of their own emotional annihilation. Not as an act of cruelty, but as an act of fierce, unshakable self-protection, one that no one ever believed they were capable of wielding. And that is precisely the moment they transform into the most dangerous kind of person, the one who is no longer available for exploitation. For years, you've been told the same thing. Too sensitive, too emotional, too much. But what if the real problem was never your sensitivity at all? What if the world has been wrong about you from the beginning? What if the real flaw lies in a society that confuses emotional intelligence with emotional servitude, a culture that mistakes your deep capacity to feel with an endless obligation to fix? Empaths have always been profoundly misunderstood, not because they are mystical enigmas, but because their deepest strength remains hidden, cloaked, until the moment it finally tears free from the chains they placed upon themselves. From the outside, you look endlessly available, like a lighthouse that never switches off its beam. You're the one people call when their world is falling apart, the one who quietly absorbs burdens too heavy for others to bear. Yet who answers the phone when your world begins to collapse? You've carried grief that was never yours. You've mended wounds you never inflicted. You've apologized for boundaries you had every right to set. And piece by piece, you've allowed yourself to become the dumping ground for everyone else's chaos. Meanwhile, your own pain drifts into silence, unnoticed, unattended, unloved. The exhaustion you carry runs far deeper than ordinary tiredness. It is the bone-deep weariness of someone who has built safe harbors for everyone else, yet forgotten they are still drowning in their own storm. Carl Jung described this unbearable contradiction as the shadow self, the sharp tension between the polished persona we show the world and the authentic fragments of our being we exile in order to be accepted. For empaths, that polished mask is the eternal rescuer. You've perfected the art of smiling even as you're breaking, of offering comfort while carrying your own pain, of staying calm in the chaos while pretending that this constant emotional labor doesn't quietly kill something vital inside you. But beneath that carefully constructed mask of infinite availability lives someone who has never truly felt seen, someone who carries the weight of other people's burdens as though they were personally responsible for everyone's emotional well-being, someone who has quietly convinced themselves that being needed is the same as being loved, that being useful is the same as being valued, but deep down, it's not. And somewhere inside, beneath all the conditioning you were taught to label as compassion, a truth waits. Take a moment and ask yourself, when was the last time someone genuinely asked how you were doing, and then stayed long enough to hear your real answer? When was the last time anyone held space for your pain with the same patience you have always offered them? The reality is, You've been carrying the emotional weight of others for so long that you've almost forgotten what it feels like to move lightly, freely, without the invisible chains of responsibility. You've been so occupied with becoming everyone else's therapist that you've neglected your own need for care. You've sacrificed yourself so consistently that self-care now feels foreign, indulgent, even wrong. Psychologists call this emotional parentification. The moment you become responsible for regulating everyone else's feelings, while your own remain unwitnessed, unprocessed, unhealed. You've been giving from an empty cup for so long that you can't remember what it feels like to drink from it yourself. That dissonance grows unbearable. Part of you knows with painful clarity that you're being used. Yet another part has built your entire sense of identity on being needed. Part of you aches for reciprocity. But another has been conditioned to believe that asking for support is selfish, undeserving. And so quietly, invisibly, something inside begins to collapse, not with drama, but with a silence so complete it can't be ignored. But what happens next is not weakness. It's not a breakdown, though it may feel like one in the moment. It is instead the beginning of the most profound transformation you will ever undergo. It is your psyche refusing to fragment any further, your very soul awakening to the truth of your worth. And this awakening doesn't arrive with trumpets or grand declarations. Doesn't erupt all at once in some cinematic revelation. Instead, it unfolds in whispers, in subtle shifts that others mistake for temporary stress or passing moods. You stop automatically saying yes to requests that drain you. Crises that once triggered anxious, frantic attempts at rescue now barely register as emergencies in your world. You begin to set boundaries without the familiar weight of guilt pressing down on your chest. You retreat from conversations that once consumed hours of your emotional energy. You no longer feel compelled to mend what others break, nor to soothe what others disturb. Your body may still be present in those spaces, but your soul has begun to step back, quietly, firmly, creating a distance between who you are and the role you once performed so faithfully, endlessly, exhaustingly. This is what Jung called enantiodromia, the unbearable psychological pressure of holding two opposing forces within yourself, pulling in opposite directions until one day something deep inside can no longer bear the weight of the contradiction. It is not a collapse born from weakness, but an inevitable breaking of the old pattern. Let me tell you about Sarah. She was 34, a social worker and a compulsive emotional rescuer. She was the dependable friend everyone dialed during their 2 a.m. breakdowns, the one who never failed to answer the phone. She was also the daughter who carried her mother's depression like an inheritance and absorbed her father's rage as if it were her own fault to fix. At work, she became the colleague who quietly absorbed everyone's stress while her own projects withered in silence. For 15 long years, Sarah lived in that tension. She truly believed that love meant being endlessly available, that hypervigilance was nothing more than sharpened intuition. She wore her exhaustion like a badge of honor, proof of her devotion, even as it slowly consumed her. But silence carries a cost that grows heavier with time. The body begins to speak the truths the mind refuses to face. For Sarah, the warnings came as chronic fatigue, anxiety attacks, nights of insomnia, and even digestive issues that no medicine could calm. Her body screamed the truths her voice had been trained to whisper. And the breaking point didn't arrive with a dramatic confrontation or an explosive crisis. It appeared on an ordinary Tuesday when her sister called once again to complain about the same relationship that had been a cycle of heartbreak for 3 years. And this time, something inside Sarah shifted. For the very first time in her life, she felt absolutely nothing. Not frustration, not concern, not even that familiar compulsion to rescue. What she felt was a crystalline clarity that rose from the deepest part of her being. I'm done. She didn't slam the phone down. She didn't deliver a lecture. She simply listened with the quiet detachment of someone watching a situation she now understood was no longer her responsibility to solve. That was the exact moment Sarah's shadow began to integrate. The moment she stopped being available for her own destruction. And maybe you recognize this moment too, the moment when caring no longer feels like love, but like self-abandonment. When empathy no longer feels like a gift, but instead like a prison you have locked yourself inside with no one holding the key but you. And that moment marks the beginning of what Jung called shadow integration. Not the dark, evil parts of yourself as people often fear, but the parts you were taught to hide and reject in order to be loved. The parts that can say no without guilt. The parts that can choose self-protection over self-sacrifice. The parts that refuse to keep setting themselves on fire just to keep others warm. Sarah's boundaries did not appear overnight. They rose slowly, deliberately, built brick by brick out of every memory of being taken for granted. They grew stronger with every moment her kindness was mistaken for weakness. With every instance, someone unloaded their chaos onto her shoulders while offering nothing in return. Those boundaries don't scream and they don't shout to prove themselves. They don't rush to defend or justify their existence. They don't need validation, nor do they demand lengthy explanations. They simply stand quiet, solid, and unshakable between the person you once were and the person you are steadily becoming. And there you stand right behind them. Not hiding in fear anymore, but finally, unmistakably, unavailable to be used. This isn't cruelty, this isn't coldness. This is your nervous system finally saying with a clarity your voice never dared to carry, I've had enough. Jung understood that the psyche carries a natural drive toward wholeness. When we fracture ourselves, burying our needs to keep relationships intact, silencing our authentic responses to preserve peace, something deep within us begins to resist. It pushes back. It demands integration. And so the question arises, what parts of yourself have you silenced just to feel loved? Which pieces of your authentic self have you buried so far beneath the surface that you've nearly forgotten they exist? The collapse, when it comes, is not weakness exposing itself. It is strength, long hidden, finally refusing to stay underground. It is your soul declaring, I will not fragment any more. I will not abandon myself for the sake of someone else's comfort. I will not vanish just to make others feel whole. This is not the end of you. It is the beginning of becoming dangerous in the most profound way. Dangerous not because you harm others, but because you are no longer available to be harmed through self-erasure. And yet, this awakening is often misinterpreted. To family members and old friends, it can look like selfishness. They watch in confusion, sometimes in alarm, as you stop managing their emotions like it's your sacred duty. They whisper that you've grown cold, distant, changed. They say you're not yourself anymore, but isn't it ironic? Because in truth, you are becoming more yourself than you have ever been. The integrated empath does not lose their capacity for compassion. What they lose is the compulsive need to sacrifice themselves in the name of it. They can still feel deeply, but they are no longer drowning in the depths of everyone else's pain. They can still care, but they are no longer carrying what isn't theirs to bear. This is the turning point that makes the awakened empath so threatening to systems built on their exhaustion, to dynamics that depended on their endless giving. You begin to protect your peace with a fierceness greater than the effort you once spent protecting your reputation. You stop translating other people's chaos into your own sense of responsibility. And in that moment, the world around you pushes back. They want the old version of you, the one who absorbed their anxiety, who managed their emotions, who made their dysfunction feel lighter by taking it onto your own shoulders. But you've stepped away from that role. You have laid down the savior complex. You are no longer available to heal wounds that were never yours to begin with. And that very refusal, calm, steady, and absolute, is what makes the integrated empath so unsettling to systems built on invisible emotional labor. Now you begin to guard your energy more fiercely than you ever guarded your image. You no longer absorb other people's chaos into your nervous system. Instead, you cultivate something far more powerful, what I call conscious empathy. You can still feel others' emotions, but you're no longer compelled to fix them. You can still sense their pain, yet you no longer drown alongside them. You can still witness their struggles, but you've released the belief that it is your emergency to resolve. To outsiders, especially those who benefited from your old patterns of self-abandonment, this new version of you looks like selfishness. But to those who know the hunger of emotional starvation, who know what it means to keep feeding everyone else while starving inside themselves, this shift is what self-respect finally looks like. You're no longer waiting to be chosen by others, because you've already made the most radical choice. You've chosen yourself. You stop offering endless explanations for boundaries to people who never respected them in the first place. You stop proving your worth to those who only ever took it for granted. You stop performing the exhausting role of emotional caretaker, the unpaid therapist of every room you walked into. And this level of emotional sovereignty is disruptive, even threatening, to a world built on women's invisible, unpaid emotional labor. The moment you refuse to participate in relationships where you are expected to shrink yourself to keep others comfortable, people notice. When you stop engaging with individuals who mistake your boundaries for betrayal, they don't let go easily. They escalate their demands. But here's what they fail to see. You haven't become heartless. What's happened is far more powerful. You've simply become unavailable for heartbreak, both the kind you give and the kind you receive. You refuse to participate in the cultural gaslighting that labels healthy boundaries as selfishness. The transformed empath is not cruel. They are simply unavailable for cruelty. They are not cold. They are simply unavailable for being burned. They are not selfish. They are, at last, included in their own circle of care. And through this shift, you've learned the most vital difference, the line that changes everything. The difference between being loving and being used, between being caring and being consumed, between being supportive and being depleted. This is your individuation. This is your return to self. This is your dangerous awakening to the immeasurable worth you've carried all along. And to make it clear, let me tell you about Marcus. He was the dependable friend, the one whose door was always open, whose shoulder was always available. His apartment slowly turned into a crisis center for everyone else's emergencies. Marcus measured his worth by how needed he was. He equated friendship with usefulness, mistaking endless availability for love. But constant giving from an empty well eventually cracked something inside him, not his capacity to love, but his willingness to keep loving others more than himself. The shift arrived quietly on an ordinary night. His best friend called at 2 a.m., drunk and crying about the same toxic relationship for what felt like the 100th time. Instead of his usual hour-long counseling session, Marcus surprised himself by saying, "I can't do this tonight. Call me when you're sober and ready to make different choices." Just that. No lengthy explanation, no softening apology, no alternative solution, just a boundary. His friend was stunned. "But I thought you cared about me," he protested, trying to weaponize Marcus's compassion against him. And Marcus, steady and calm, replied, "I do care about you, but I care about me too, now." That's the line that changes everything. But I care about me too. Have you noticed how differently people begin to treat you when you stop being endlessly available to absorb their problems? How some relationships quietly evaporate the moment you are no longer willing to be the one who always gives more. This shift isn't about becoming heartless. It's about finally having a heart that belongs to you first. The people who genuinely love you will grow to respect your boundaries. The people who are only using you will expose themselves through their resistance to your growth. And that is precisely what makes you dangerous in the most beautiful way possible. You become dangerous to anyone who confuses kindness with weakness, empathy with availability, love with something they can simply take without offering anything in return. Because here's the truth. People don't fear the empath when they're pouring everything out, when they're giving until it hurts. They fear the empath when they stop giving anything that isn't freely chosen. Suddenly the person who once absorbed their anxiety now reflects it back to them. The person who once made excuses for their behavior now simply observes it without rushing to explain it away. This shift terrifies those who built their stability on your instability, their comfort on your willingness to be uncomfortable, their peace on your constant acceptance of chaos. Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And for the empath, that moment of authentic becoming is quiet but irreversible. It doesn't arrive with fanfare or lengthy justifications. It simply is. You begin choosing your peace with more ferocity than you ever protected your reputation. You no longer translate other people's dysfunction into your own sense of responsibility. You still feel their discomfort, but you no longer treat it as your emergency to resolve it. You start choosing solitude over performance, authenticity over acceptance, your own approval over their fleeting validation. Slowly, you develop selective empathy. You can still feel deeply, but you are no longer compelled to act on every feeling. To those who've lived through emotional starvation while feeding everyone else, this is what self-respect looks like. You're no longer waiting to be chosen by others because you've already chosen yourself. This is your individuation. This is your return to self. This is your dangerous awakening to your immeasurable worth. The awakened empath doesn't lose their gift. They simply stop giving it away to those who don't value it. They don't become cold. They simply become unavailable for being burned. They don't stop caring. They finally begin caring for themselves too. You've learned that you can love people and still have boundaries, that you can care for others without carrying their burdens. You can be supportive without being depleted. And in the end, the transformed empath is not bitter or closed off from love. They are free. Free from the exhausting performance of being who others needed them to be instead of who they really are. Free from the constant anxiety of managing everyone else's emotions while their own were left to wither. Sarah, now 2 years into her transformation, lives a life that her former self would hardly recognize. She has relationships that reciprocate her energy instead of draining it dry. She has boundaries that are respected rather than constantly tested. She still works in social services, but she approaches it from a place of conscious choice instead of compulsive rescue. She can hold space without drowning. She can care without losing herself in the process. This is what Jung called the individuated self, a soul no longer split between pleasing others and honoring its own truth. You've turned your pain into discernment, your silence into a sanctuary. Every wound now rests within a boundary that protects rather than punishes. You are no longer the empath who breaks under the weight of others' expectations. You are the empath who broke free from them and discovered your strength. You're not the one who gives until there's nothing left. You're the one who finally understands that you cannot pour from an empty cup. So pause and ask yourself, what would change in your life today if you truly believed you were worthy of the same love and consideration you've always given so freely to others? The answer to that question, that's where your transformation begins. It is your journey through the shadow, through integration, through the dangerous awakening to your own value. And this isn't just personal healing. It is a radical act of love in a world that has forgotten what healthy relationships look like. You become the living example, the walking proof, the breathing demonstration that it is possible to be soft and strong at the same time, generous and boundaried, loving and self-protective. In becoming dangerous to those who would exploit you, you become safe for those who would truly love you. You become a beacon for other empaths still drowning in their own compassion. Your transformation gives them permission to value themselves. Your boundaries show them what self-respect looks like. Your refusal to abandon yourself teaches them that they never have to abandon themselves either. You're not too much. You never were. You are perfectly calibrated for a world that desperately needs the medicine of conscious empathy. Empathy given from choice, not compulsion. Your journey to wholeness matters not just for you, but for everyone who will benefit from your authentic, bounded, consciously loving presence in this world.